Continuing on with Chapter 23, we're looking at the Gilded Age, the 3 decades following the Civil War, in which everything seems nice and shiny from the outside, but there's a lot of corruption going on right underneath the surface. So, one of the major problems that students of history have with the Gilded Age is it's very difficult to pin down what Republicans wanted at this time and what Democrats wanted at this time. And the reason for that being is because there really isn't much difference, that is, between Republicans and Democrats. Mostly what they're focusing on during this period of time is keeping their jobs. So they're going to say whatever they need to in order to keep their job. There's not much difference. One of the major hallmarks, though, of the Gilded Age elections is that there is very high voter turnout, as high as 80% in some elections, and extreme party loyalty. Now, the reason for such high party loyalty is because of that spoils system, or patronage, or cronyism. All those things mean the same. Because if I am a good Democrat or if I am a good Republican, I can get a good civil service job, possibly working for the federal government or working for the state government, whatever it is. There is money to be made by being a good party advocate. And so we see some differences, not a lot, but some differences. On the Republican side, now keep in mind, even though these are the modern-day Republican and Democratic parties, there is a lot of changing that's still going to happen between this time and modern day today. On the Republican side, that old Puritan lineage is still to some degree at work there, and the Republicans, many of them during this time, believe that the government should be more involved in regulating the economy. Their constituency base is primarily in the Midwest, rural towns, New England, the freedmen, because remember, African Americans owed their freedom to the Republican Party. This is the party of Lincoln after all. And in fact, African Americans tended to vote for the Republican Party all the way up until FDR in 1932. And also the Grand Army of the Republic. These are Civil War veterans. These are the base of the Republican Party. The Democrats, on the other hand, we see a large constituency base among immigrants, and they believe that there should be less government involvement, or laissez-faire, hands-off. Predominantly, we see this in the industrial cities. Like we said, Tammany Hall was a Democratic political machine. Chicago was a big Democratic town, Boston, etc. And also in the South. The Solid South, for similar reasons, tended to vote for the Democratic Party for years and years and years to come, because they are voting against the party of Lincoln. So those Redeemer governments were solidly Democrat. So the Solid South, Redeemer governments, all of this means the same. They are solidly Democrat. But even within each of the parties, there are factions forming. So we'll talk about the Republicans first. Even within the Republican Party, there are factions or divisions within this party, specifically between the Stalwarts and the half-breeds. Now, what these have in common is they are both Republicans. But what they differ over the issue of patronage, or that spoils system. Now, on the one side, the Stalwarts, this faction led by the Senator Roscoe Conkling from New York, he advocates for trading civil service jobs for votes. So he's all about the spoils system. He's all about patronage. Who cares who is working at the post office or who is working at the Treasury Department, as long as it's a good Republican that's done something for the party lately? The other side of this coin are the half-breeds, led by the congressman from Maine, James G. Blaine. He was a half-breed who said that there should be civil service reform, meaning we should only have qualified people working for the federal government. Now, we have this mentality that everyone in government is an elected official, but there are thousands upon thousands of people who work for the federal government who are not elected. These are the jobs that we're talking about. The one side says, let's only put good Republicans in power, and the other side is saying, let's have civil service reform. Only qualified people should be given these jobs. So this, to some degree, creates some deadlock within the Republican Party. And that's going to be important later on. So 1876 rolls around, and this is a crazy important election. Even though the presidents of the Gilded Age are often referred to as the forgotten presidents, because really who cares about Rutherford B. Hayes, this election actually changed a lot in the United States at this time. In 1876, the three-term governor from Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, was nominated. He is relatively unknown, which kind of made both the half-breeds and the Stalwarts happy because they didn't really know much about him. But what they do know is that, much like it is today, Ohio was a swing state in 1876 with their 22 electoral votes. You needed Ohio to win, much like you need Ohio today. The Democrats nominated Samuel J. Tilden, who had made a name for himself convicting Boss Tweed in New York. Now, when the election was going on, this is still in that window of time when not all of the states have been fully reconstructed, meaning not all of the states have been completely returned back to power. It comes down to election night. Samuel J. Tilden received 184 electoral votes. Now, he literally needed 185 to win the presidency. So it comes down to one electoral vote. And there are three southern states which are contested. Three southern states, namely South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, had sent back contrasting returns, meaning election fraud or whatever it is. We don't know who won these three states, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Tilden needs one of those states to win. Rutherford B. Hayes needs all three in order to be elected president. Now, let's be real here. Do you really think South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana would vote for a Republican? Of course not, but that's another story for another day. And so the Electoral Count Act was passed very quickly by Congress because we need a president, and we're hanging in the balance here in 1876. We need somebody to be inaugurated in 1877. This set up an electoral commission, which was supposed to be bipartisan, meaning an equal number of Democrats and Republicans were supposed to sit on this commission to help count the ballots or determine which of the election results they were going to take. Now, the reality was the majority of the people on the Electoral Commission were actually Republican. So this really isn't that bipartisan of a commission. So here you see those three states that are disputed in 1876, but notice every other southern state had voted for Tilden. So a compromise is needed because many of the southern states and the Democratic Party themselves actually are extremely angry over the way this electoral commission was tending to vote. And they were threatening to filibuster, which means to bring everything to a dead halt if something wasn't done. And so a compromise was needed. The Compromise of 1877, which is crazy, crazy important, is this deal. This is a backroom deal that basically the Republicans and the Democrats came up with to basically hand Hayes the presidency. Essentially, the Republicans were saying, don't contest these three states. Allow these three states to allegedly vote for Hayes, the Republican, and we will give you some stuff. Here's what was promised. To remove all federal troops remaining in the South. Essentially, the Republicans are ending military reconstruction in 1877. To allow one Southern Democrat in the cabinet. To help create a transcontinental railroad to be built through Texas. And to pass legislation to help industrialize the South. This was never done. This Compromise of 1877 marks the official end to Reconstruction. This is the moment where the Republicans turn their backs on African Americans in the South and allow Democrats to take back control over the South, to end Reconstruction and allow a return to those Redeemer governments in the South in order for Rutherford B. Hayes to be elected president in 1877. And the last-ditch attempt by the Republicans to help these African Americans and to end discrimination was with the Civil Rights Act of 1875 to prohibit discrimination in jury selection and to give equal accommodations in public places. However, this was largely ignored in the South, and the federal government essentially didn't do anything up until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1900s to help restore a balance of power in the South. Okay, here you see the political cartoon depicting Rutherford B. Hayes riding the donkey, which is the Electoral Commission, and Louisiana, his legs kicking Samuel Tilden in the gut on the ground, to him taking control over that Democratic donkey. Now, with a return to the solid South, these Redeemer state governments came back in control. These are solidly democratic state governments. And very, very quickly, they denied any power or equality to African Americans, evicting them from their homes, from their farms, using physical harm to intimidate them, keeping them from equal employment. The sheer intimidation of African Americans down south. And very quickly, we start to see the creation of a new norm, sharecropping, which is also known as tenant farming, or the crop lien system. Basically, this forces African Americans and other poor whites, for that matter, into a perpetual state of debt to those who own the land. Now, if African Americans are not allowed to own land, and poor white people as well worked as tenant farmers, all they could do was rent a piece of land from a landowner. This is tenant farming. If you're a tenant in an apartment, you don't own the apartment. You just live there and pay rent. And so with this system, the sharecropping or tenant farming, they are in perpetual debt to their landlords because they can never pay enough in rent to get out of debt. They pay a crop lien or a mortgage on their crop every year. However, it's very, very difficult to ever get out of this. So it's essentially tying generations of African Americans and poor whites down to the land because they can never get out of debt. Also, in order to keep African Americans in their place, we see local and state governments passing what become collectively known as Jim Crow laws. These are state-sanctioned discrimination laws that create legalized segregation. And if that's not enough, we also see lynchings, literacy tests, poll taxes, whatever it is to keep African Americans from voting in the South. So even though the 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote, this is largely ignored in the South for the next 100 years or so by passing literacy tests, poll taxes, and even through lynching and hanging of African American men to, quote, keep them in their place. So thousands upon thousands of African American men were disenfranchised, meaning denied the right to vote, as a result of these actions on the part of southern states. And in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson, and this is a crazy important Supreme Court case, that, quote, separate but equal does not violate the 14th Amendment. Now remember, the 14th Amendment granted equal citizenship rights to African Americans. But Jim Crow laws are essentially creating separate spheres or separate accommodations. Plessy versus Ferguson says that's completely fine as long as those separate spheres, separate schools, separate water fountains, separate waiting rooms are, quote, equal. The reality, of course they're not equal. There's no way a white school and a black school are going to be equal. There's no way that restrooms for African Americans and whites are going to be equal. But this gives them an excuse to turn their back and allow this segregation to continue on. Plessy versus Ferguson remains the law of the land all the way until 1954, when it was overturned with Brown versus the Board of Education, which we'll obviously get to later on. Here you see a southern plantation before and after the Civil War. You notice with the one on the left that there's a large plantation that is owned obviously by one person, the, quote, master. And after the Civil War in 1881, it's largely the same area, but you notice all of the tenants who are living and working this farm. They don't own it, but they rent a small piece of land and then pay a lien or a mortgage on their crop every single year. It becomes difficult to pay off that mortgage to the owner of this plantation. Here you see the lynchings throughout the United States all the way up until 1968. Now, obviously, the majority of them are in the South, but by no means does that mean this wasn't occurring in northern states as well. Here you see a photograph, obviously this is not from the 1800s, depicting a whole town coming out to watch a lynching. And notice that they're not at all worried about having their photograph taken in front of these dead bodies hanging in a tree, because what all-white jury was going to convict them of murdering black men in the South? Now, we also see social corruption other than just Jim Crow, but we see social corruption out on the West Coast when it comes to Chinese immigrants. In 1880, There were about 75,000 Asians living on the West Coast, primarily in California. Most of them had come here to work on that transcontinental railroad, to build the transcontinental railroad. Now, about half of them actually returned back to China after their job was done. But for those who stayed behind, many of them did not bring women, they did not bring children with them. They were essentially social pariahs in American society at this time. They didn't have children to help them with assimilation like every other immigrant group had done. And they are competing for the most menial jobs out on the West Coast once that transcontinental railroad is done being built. Now, lo and behold, who are they competing with on the bottom? Once again, the Irish, because as we know, the Irish are always competing for the most menial jobs, like we saw with African Americans back east. And so, in San Francisco, Irish-born Dennis Kearney started to use nativist tactics and nativist rhetoric and violence against Chinese because they are competition for cheap labor on the very, very bottom. So whereas Dennis Kearney is Irish-born, he's starting to say what every other group has said in the past: we are real Americans, they are not. Let's go get them, because they are competition for that cheap labor on the bottom. And there is so much pressure put on the U.S. government that in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is essentially closing immigration from China down to the United States to a very, very, very small trickle. And essentially all Chinese immigration is ended up until 1943 as a result. This is absolutely discrimination on the part of the American people against the Chinese. And in the court case of U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898, the Supreme Court ruled that citizenship rights are based on where you are born, not based on your parents' nationality. So there had also been a movement pushing that Chinese people born here in America should be denied citizenship rights because their parents had been born overseas. This is the difference between jus soli, which is of the soil. If you are born on American soil, you are an American, versus jus sanguinii, of the blood. So if your parents were born elsewhere, you are not a real citizen. So this is a strike back against that nativist rhetoric in order to help Chinese retain some citizenship rights if they were born here in the United States.